Okay. We're getting there. So in this session, we are going to talk about evaluation. Now, we have been reminded over and over again this morning that evidence is important. And somehow there seems to be quite a bit of pressure on the people working on evidence and creating evidence to create better evidence, more credible evidence. We heard that we need to sell the approach to convince others, so we need evidence for that. Yesterday, there was a pre-conference session about adaptive programming. We need evidence for that. So we have a whole track on this conference about evidence. There are going to be 4 breakout sessions, and there is going to be a plenary tomorrow as well in the morning about the politics behind and around evidence. But today we want to have a specific focus on evaluation, on external evaluation, evaluation of market systems development programs, and what are the things we need to pay attention to, what kind of approaches can we use. We will start with the theory part. We hear from 2 speakers who have recently developed guidelines around how to do evaluation in Market Systems Program. We'll hear from Dr. Elizabeth Dunn, who is the president of Impact LLC and the principal investigator of USAID's Leveraging Economic Opportunities project. And we will also hear from Finn O'Sullivan, who is a senior consultant at ITED and also works on the BEAM team. And they will introduce us to not the whole silver bullet of how to start and how to end with evaluation, but a few key concepts, a few key aspects we need to take care of. So I would like to give the word to Elizabeth to start us off.
The BEAM guidelines that Finn is going to talk about are focused on impact evaluation, while this LEO framework attempts to address a range of evaluation settings, including real-time sense-making for adaptive management, monitoring of early project outcomes, midterm evaluation, and impact evaluation. So while the LEO framework covers all 4 of these settings, BEAM addresses these different settings, but in different documents. So this document that Finn is going to talk about is in particular focused on impact evaluation. As I mentioned in the introduction, the LEO framework consists of 9 topic areas. And here are the first 4 topics, which relate basically to systems and complexity. Since I plan to spend most of the minutes that I have here focusing on these first 3 topics and their recommendations, I'm going to skip those for now, come back to them in just a minute. The 4th topic, which corresponds to the 4th bullet point up on the slide, is about describing the dynamics both of the intervention and of the context within which it's operating. The graphic relates to a recommendation under that topic to connect the evaluation with program implementation using feedback loops. And so the idea here is that the evaluation results should feed into program adaptation. I mean, we all know that, but then it doesn't happen so often. And then these program adaptations, in turn, should feed into modifications of the design for the evaluation, which will then generate results, which then should be feeding back into the program. So you have a continuous updating process of the evaluation design. The bullets on this next slide, so these are the first 4 topics, and here are the remaining 5 topics. These relate to theory and methods, and while we don't have time to cover each of these 5 topics and their corresponding recommendations, several of these concepts will reemerge throughout the session in the remarks that the other speakers are going to make. And you can see in particular theory-based evaluation and methodological validity will be coming up. So I can't cover those. The 3 topics that I want to discuss in more detail are the first 3, which are thinking systemically, navigating complexity, and evaluating systemic change. So let's turn to those. and start with thinking systemically. There are 3 recommendations under this topic area. The first recommendation is to expand the boundaries of the evaluation in order to identify interlinked systems and key features within those related systems that may have significant potential to influence program outcomes. Using the targeted value chains as anchors, boundaries can be expanded conceptually in 2 directions. One direction is to zoom out. And in zooming out to the larger context, important features, significant features can be incorporated from related systems, including market systems, the macroeconomy, the business enabling environment, supporting markets, and other economic, political, and environmental systems. So that's zooming out. The other direction is more conceptual, and that's zooming in. And zooming in to look at details that affect the behavior of actors within the system. And so some examples here would, and these would be things that affect the incentives and motivations, including links to their functional roles within the market, their socioeconomic or sociocultural characteristics, and even intra-household dynamics. So you're really zooming in. The second recommendation under thinking systemically is to map and measure system relationships. There are a variety of ways to map system relationships, ranging from very simple, conceptual, intuitive ways to mapping approaches that are very detailed and even data intensive. No matter the level of detail, however, any map of systems is going to include at least 2 elements. It's going to include these 2 elements. One, which are the actors in the system, and the other element that would be included are the linkages or relationships between the actors. Once the system is mapped, then the evaluation can focus on looking for changes in the structure of the system or changes in the nature of relationships or both. Okay? Changes in the structure of a system can be identified as new actors and new linkages. And of course, the reverse is also true. It could be a reduction in actors and a reduction in linkages. Changes in the nature of relationships refers to what is actually happening in and through the linkages. These changes might be measured quantitatively or qualitatively. Some examples of quantitative measures include things like product flows, payments, frequency of transactions, repeat transactions, measures of embedded service flows, for example. Other examples of qualitative measures include indicators of the trust that exists in each direction in the relationship, the quality of information sharing. So the point, though, is that not everything is necessarily quantitative. Some of it is qualitative. The third recommendation under thinking systemically is to incorporate multiple perspectives into the evaluation process. It's important to bring these multiple perspectives in at more than one point of the evaluation, including important times to bring in multiple perspectives would be in the design of the evaluation, in reviewing midterm information, midterm results, and certainly during the interpretation of the findings before the documents are written and those findings have been fully interpreted. And once we start to think about how are we going to go about this process of bringing in multiple perspectives, our minds very quickly turn to participatory approaches, which leads right into the next topic of navigating complexity. The recommendation here, the first recommendation under navigating complexity, is to include participation at all levels and stages of the evaluation. The previous slide looked at different stages of the evaluation, and I'd like to try to share a little bit of information about what we mean by different levels. One level is illustrated in a new mechanism that USAID is using called the Broad Agency Announcement, or BAA. And these are designed to solve research and development issues by early and full co-creation of external partners. BAAs are collaborative ways to bring together a range of stakeholders and incorporate some very different perspectives into a design. At another level, another USAID mechanism that is being developed is called CLA. CLA stands for Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting. It uses a variety of participatory approaches. Prominent among those, however, are peer learning networks. So peer learning networks are a good way to bring together people working on different projects within a similar area. So they're the monitoring and evaluation and the program people of multiple projects that are operating in the same geographic area. The PIALA approach, which Adinda is going to talk about, is participatory in many different levels, and in particular engaging stakeholders in the evaluation design and in the sense-making of evidence. A second recommendation under navigating complexity is to place sensors that will allow the detection of unanticipated outcomes. Unanticipated outcomes or unanticipated consequences are a blind spot in evaluation because they fall outside the areas where we normally cast our measurement nets. Okay? However, since market systems development programs are often operating partially in complex environments, our evaluation approaches must be sensitive enough to detect unanticipated consequences. Some of the ways to do this include the developmental evaluation approaches as popularized by Michael Quinn Patton. And there are a number of tools for complexity-aware monitoring, such as, many of you are probably familiar with the most significant change approach, outcome harvesting, and process monitoring of impacts, or PMI. Let's turn to the third and final topic, which is evaluating systemic change. Okay. Systemic change, how to achieve it and how to measure it is, of course, these are very exciting topics that are drawing a lot of attention throughout our market systems community. And both Beam and Leo are actively investigating these topics. And that's because when it comes to evaluating market systems development, there's a need for a dual emphasis in evaluation that looks not only at the outcomes for target beneficiaries, but also at systemic change itself. So the first recommendation under evaluating systemic change is to define systemic change for the specific context and intervention. This is the recommendation. I still would like to see some general definitions, and of course, some general frameworks are very helpful. But under this, the recommendation is that you need a more concrete and specific understanding of how systemic change is expected to occur within this specific program and in its particular setting, because that's the first step toward identifying meaningful, useful, practical indicators of systemic change. So we're going to see a great example of that in the evaluation that Adrienne will describe. The second recommendation under evaluating systemic change is to select tools and methods for measuring it. When it comes to measuring systemic change, there are two general approaches. One approach is to identify indicators and then track them over time. The essential foundation for selecting indicators is this program and context-specific understanding of systemic change that was recommended previously. Once these indicators are selected, in general, they can be measured using standard or well understood data collection and analysis approaches. On the other hand, the alternative approach is to use one or more of the specialized tools that have been especially adapted for monitoring systemic change. These are still, being tested. The Leo project has been investigating the use of some of these tools. Several of the methods and tools are listed in the slide. And there is a session tomorrow morning on systemic change, and I expect some of these tools will be discussed in that session. Yes? Okay. That was my guess, anyway. All right. Before I close, I'd like to provide you with these links, these two links at the bottom. Either one, you can go to either one of them. They will give you access to a lot of resources. You know, I work in LEO, I work in monitoring and evaluation, but there's been all kinds of stuff developed under LEO. So if you're interested in that, go to one of these links at the bottom. And I also provide my email address because while I hope to get some feedback from you this morning, I'm also interested in any ideas or feedback that you might have. If you would like to be notified when the evaluation framework becomes published, because it's not published yet, if you'd like to be notified, send me your email address. And if you'd like to share some ideas or discuss how this framework might help you with evaluating your programs, please feel free to contact me. And I want to close then with a summary statement that the LEO evaluation framework identifies 9 ways to improve the evaluation of market systems development programs. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, really. And I'm going to present very briefly or tell you something about the Beam Exchange's own guidelines for impact evaluation of market systems approaches or programs. And, well, I'll just go straight into it, and then I'll explain how it relates to what's been said already. The first thing to say is, well, the guidelines were published in November last year, and the idea is that they will be revised and developed as experience from the field becomes available. But the basic content is to explain, to set out a range of issues to take into account when thinking about how to design or implement an evaluation in this context. And then secondly, to address some of the difficult issues that we've encountered in the field. And I wanted to say that these guidelines are not the final word. They will be updated. And there's some things, I think they add a lot to our understanding, but there are some areas where there is more to be done. And I think I'm really delighted to hear what Elizabeth has just told us about the LEO guidelines, and I'm really looking forward to reading those in due course as well. And I think that there will certainly be a lot to be gained from reading both of those. So just to come back, why, after that brief introduction, why do we need these guidelines? And there's 2 main reasons. Firstly, that there were some evaluations that have been done over previous years in this field, but with some identified weaknesses, which are not surprising given that we have all been struggling with some of the issues around, for example, systemic change. So I think it's not surprising that it's taking some time to move forward. But some of the weaknesses in particular were around, for example, the robustness of how quantitative data has been used and sampling frames and sample sizes and so on, but also the robustness of qualitative methods. And then uncertainty about which evaluation designs or methods are appropriate. We probably all had this quotation that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in evaluation. And so people ask the question, well, where does that fit in this context? But having identified those limitations, there's clearly a need to address them, and that's part of what this document is trying to do. And then secondly, there is obviously a need for evidence, and we've just heard from the various speakers in the opening speeches this morning talking about the fact that there is still a need for robust evidence in this field, that we all believe, I think, as practitioners, we've all seen results on the ground and we feel that this approach can deliver really important benefits for poor people, but where is the robust evidence? And so we are moving forward in that area, but there is still a need to agree, I think, the outlines of a common approach, and that's what this is trying to do. And so the evaluation guidance, well, I urge you all to have a look and to read them, or if you want, come along this afternoon to the poster presentation and I'll talk in more detail if you've got particular questions. But I mean, some of the issues that that are addressed in the guidelines are, what are the implications for evaluation in a systemic context? This really fundamental question, which designs and methods can we use, and what makes an evaluation credible? So there are a range of issues, and these are just three. In fact, I'm going to talk about just one of them because we have limited time this morning, but as I say in the document, you'll find much more. So the first point, and I'm glad that there's a point of coincidence between Leo and Beam on this, is that a starting point for evaluation in a market systems context is that what we need to do needs to take theory-based evaluation as its starting point. So apologies to the evaluation specialists, but for those who maybe aren't, just very briefly to sum up what theory-based evaluation means. It sounds more grand than it is, but firstly it means developing a model which summarizes how you think what you do will lead to the outputs and outcomes and impacts that you expect. In other words, a theory of change. And then the second part is gathering evidence through various means to test if your theory works. So it's quite straightforward. And you might think that all evaluation does that, but not all designs do. And so why is theory-based evaluation the basic underlying approach to use in this context? And the first point is that market systems have several levels, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the M4p Operational guide produced by the Springfield Center, but it was in your pack, and if on the second page you'll see that donut diagram which tries to show conceptually what a market system is, and it talks about the macro level, and it talks about what's happening in between buyers and sellers, and it talks about supporting infrastructure and norms and behavior and all those things. So I think the point is that market systems are complex, and if you're looking at change in a market system, then you need to have different approaches or different methods to look at what's happening at different levels of the market system. And so you need a framework that can bring together those different methods and approaches and questions that you have in a coherent whole, and theory-based evaluation, by focusing on mechanisms, does that. And the second point is that market systems are complex, and it takes time to get things right. That quite often interventions need to have a try and see approach and to adjust what they do, and that means you need to understand the reasons why your intervention is working or is not working as well as you hoped, and that means, again, focusing on the mechanisms, and that's what theory-based evaluation does. And the last point about theory-based evaluation is methods neutral, and Elizabeth has just talked about a range of different tools or methods that you could use, and it depends on the context, it depends what you're looking at. So that's a key point, is that theory-based evaluation doesn't say employ a randomized controlled trial. It doesn't say employ a qualitative based approach. It depends on the context. And so then you have the question, if theory-based evaluation is methods neutral, then which methods can we use? And I'll go on to talk about that in my next slide. I just want you to hold this diagram in your head for a second while I continue in a moment to talk through the other slides. So a key insight or key question is, at which level of a program are you evaluating at? So we all know that programs consist of, well, normally a set of different interventions. So are you just looking at one intervention? Or are you looking at the program, which is a set of interventions and the whole thing when you're evaluating? So just bear that in mind. I'm going to try and explain these next points as simply and as untechy untechy way as I can. In evaluation, there are broadly two approaches to saying if your intervention has had an impact or not, in other words, to assessing causality. And the first one is to use experimental or statistical methods to attribute the impact of an intervention to the impact of a program or to the intervention that you're implementing. And I'm going to use that term attribution in a narrow sense of quantifying the effect using experimental or statistical methods. So as an example, there is a case study on an intervention in Nigeria, which was introducing a leasing product to get farmers to enable farmers to start using tractors. It's quite well known, that case study. It's on the DCED website. And that used a quasi-experimental approach to look at a control group and a treatment group. So the treatment group were farmers who'd used the tractors, who'd leased tractors using this model, and it looked at what the impact on their incomes was compared to a control group. And that's was a quasi-experimental approach. And such methods can be very powerful in showing the impact of a program or an intervention, but they only work in certain circumstances. This is the key point. So for example, where you can say what the target group is, and you can say in advance what the effects you're expecting to see are. And then it also requires a situation where you can identify a control group who haven't really been affected by the intervention. And we know that if your program has been working, trying to change a market system for many years, especially if it's working at national level, then it may be difficult to find people who haven't been impacted in some way or other. And then it also requires you to be able to undertake large-scale surveys, doing before and after comparisons, and that requires resources. Sometimes that's difficult. If you look at that tractor story, they talk about following these tractor drivers around rural areas, doing 13-hour days in the heat, and there's practical considerations in all of these things. So that's great in the circumstances if you can use an approach using attribution. The second approach to causality in evaluation is the principle of contribution, and this is quite different to a statistical method where you come out with a number, and instead what it does is you describe what has occurred and you describe what you think the impact is using a process of argument. So using methods which have now come to be called, for example, contribution analysis, or more recently process tracing. And so in this case, what you're doing is reviewing a range of evidence and making a case. You're not applying a formula, you're making an argument. So evaluation designs based on the principle of contribution are probably more effective. Well, they allow you to look at causality where, for example, you can't say in advance what impacts you expect to have occurred or who has been affected. And I want to say of both these principles, originally, there were people saying, well, it's only the first group which is really robust. I think that mentality is shifting. It's still under debate, but if you look at the work UK's DFID has been doing on approaches to evaluation, I think there's now a good argument that both of these approaches to assessing causality are robust or can be robust. So sorry to go so much into the theory. You're wondering, what's all this got to do with us? So I want to show what this means in the context of a market systems program. So firstly, coming back to an individual intervention, you have your intervention, you hope that it boosts incomes, you hope it increases growth, you hope that your tractor farmers, are doing better than their comparators. And you hope that this reduces their poverty levels. And you could describe these effects at the level of an individual intervention, for example, a pilot, as intervention level effects. And in this case, under certain circumstances, you can use an approach based on the principle of attribution and a quasi-experimental approach is a good example of that. But obviously in a market systems program, you're not just trying to get localized change. You want to, your innovation or your new technique or model, whatever it is, to be adopted throughout the rest of the market. So you're trying to achieve systemic change as well. And you're hoping that that systemic change will spread, it will scale up whatever effects have been realized at a local level, and you're hoping that that will further increase, you know, whatever effect, more growth and jobs or income, and that will also contribute to poverty reduction. Now, my key point here is that you may not know what kind of effect you'll have in advance. You, in the case of the tractors, you may need to go out and look at other parts of the country. Has this model been adopted by other financial institutions, the leasing model, or has it, have the tractors started to be used in other areas? And you may not be able to tell in advance where that's happened, and so you need different methods, you need a different approach, and this means you need to use an evaluation approach which is based on the principle of contribution, and some of the methods that Elizabeth and tools that she mentioned would work, under the principle of contribution, not attribution. So this is just at the level of an individual intervention. And then we also have the question of a program which is made up of a set of different interventions. And in this case, one of the key things you're wanting to look at is that, have there been synergies between your different projects? Have they worked together? Have they helped each other? Have they got in each other's way? They're an example of both of those things happening. And in this case, again, you're not going to be able to use a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experimental study or a statistical approach. You need to have a much more investigatory approach. You need to go and interview people, talk about how have your interventions worked, how did they work in synergy, what kind of impacts did this achieve. And so again, you need at the program level to incorporate into your evaluation approach the principle of contribution. So I've just touched on one part of the evaluation guidelines here, which is to talk about different approaches to causality and how you can apply them in different moments in an evaluation design, and arguably you need a combination of the two principles. So I think I'll just I'll end there, and if anyone has questions, then we can deal with those then. But thank you very much.
And then we will have Adrienne Gifford, who is a vice president at the Initiative for Global Development, and she will talk about an evaluation she has been running in Nigeria. They will touch upon, Adinda will look specifically at a couple of the points that were made, that were coming out of the theoretical part, like theory-based approach, the use of a theory of change. She will also talk about capturing multiple perspectives using participatory methods, and she will talk about assessing causality using a particular counterfactual design. Adrienne will talk about evaluating systemic change and how they approached it in the Nigeria case, and she will also talk about thinking systemically in evaluation. Just because before I give the word to Adinda, I wanted to remind you that you got these sheets on your desk, I hope, and if not, I have them at where I'm sitting. Please do jot down ideas, inspiration, quotes, things you would like to follow up on, would like to discuss in more detail. Please write them down, and I will collect them after the session. Thank you.
So my presentation is about a specific approach called PIALA that we developed with IFAD, with funding from IFAD and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We started in 2012. It took about 3 years. And the last pilot was in Ghana, so I will speak about the last pilot. And the approach was specifically developed to address some of the challenges that IFAT and its partners encounter in evaluating the impact of their programs. So the key challenges that they encounter are also those that are encountered in many programs, and especially programs that focus on market systems development. And the first is how to evaluate medium and value chain and market systems. The second is how to arrive at rigorous causal inference in the absence of credible control groups. And the third is how to trigger learning among stakeholders, with stakeholders, about contributions to inclusive and sustainable impact. Is it going? Yes. So PIALA stands for Participatory Impact Assessment and Learning Approach. And it seeks to serve three big purposes. One is to assess to what extent impacts occurred or not, and contributions have been made to impact or not. And for IFAT, this was also targeting or seeking to generate the rigorous numbers that they need to justify investments. The second big purpose is to explain why impacts occurred or not. And the purpose that it serves is to produce credible explanations that can generate systemic learning with key stakeholders. And the third is to debate where and how impacts can be enhanced. The purpose is to create solid debate among key stakeholders about contributions and about responsibilities to generate more and sustainable and more inclusive impacts. PIALA was piloted in 2 IFAT-funded programs, but with co-funding of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Well, PIALA, the piloting, not the programs. And the first one was in Vietnam, the Doing Business with the Rural Poor program, which is a purely market for the poor program. And the second one was in Ghana, was the Root and Tuber Improvement and Marketing Program, which is actually a mix of the more traditional production-focused programs combined with market systems development. Components, parts of market system development, not a complete market systems development program. So in general, IFAT-funded programs, they have 3 big areas of intervention. And the first is about smallholder commercialization, which is about enhancing production and processing and value creation. The second is mostly about facilitation of market linking of smallholder businesses. And the third is about building institutions and relationships conducive for smallholder businesses. So it's slightly different. It's not a completely market system development approach, but the approach that we developed, the PIALA approach, is actually really focusing on evaluating the impacts and the dynamics of systems. So PIALA consists of 5 big elements, and they are divided into 3 phases of evaluation, design, and management. And PIALA is also designed around 3 standards, and it has a whole framework for assessing the quality of not only the evidence, but also the processes of PIALA, of conducting an impact evaluation using PIALA around these 3 standards of rigor, inclusiveness, and feasibility. The first phase is about focusing and framing the evaluation. It's actually prior to doing the detailed design of the methodology, of the field collection, data collection methodology. And it's about engaging key stakeholders in reconstructing the theory of change of the program, which is based on the desk review, but also on interactions with key stakeholders and a design workshop. So the first, I forgot to click. I'm very sorry. Yeah. So this is the first one, the systemic theory of change approach. Did everybody, because I forgot to click for the former, is it okay for the former slide? Yeah, okay. Okay. So the first element is the theory of change, the systemic theory of change that we use to focus and frame the evaluation and to engage key stakeholders in the focusing and framing of the evaluation. The second phase is about collecting and linking the data. So it's the field work, and it's linking the data and cross-validating data during field work, for which we use, first of all, the design. It's multi-stage sampling of and in open systems. And secondly, using participatory mixed methods for data collection. The third phase is about analyzing contributions. And for that, we use participatory sense-making, involving key stakeholders in making sense of the data, of the evidence, and a configurational counterfactual analysis approach. I better look at the... OK, so the first one, this is the example of Ghana. I'm not going to walk you through the whole theory of change. I guess the slides will be available to you, but also the materials are available. So you can look at this diagram in greater detail, read through it, and come back to me with questions. But the point that I want to make is this reflects the theory of change of the program, of the root and tuber improvement and marketing program, as it was perceived by the multiple stakeholders at the moment, at the start of the impact evaluation, so in the design stage of the impact evaluation. And they agreed on it. They deconstructed and reconstructed the theory of change. And they also were engaged in identifying, you see the big circles, in identifying the contribution claims and the impact claim. Where is the pointer here? Yeah, so this is the impact claim. Here you have the ultimate impact that this program sought to achieve, which is about greater access to food and income to sustain an active and healthy life by all households in the area, project intervention areas. The change that would lead to that ultimate impact, as assumed by the program, was that improved root and tuber-based livelihoods would lead to this broad impact in all households, in all the project area. And then you have here the contribution, 3 contribution claims, yeah, which reflects the different intervention areas of the program, about programming, about processing, about production, about market linking. So different intervention areas with different outcomes, with different mechanisms. Yeah. So we identify with the with the program stakeholders who took part in the design workshop, which of the causal links needed to be evaluated. And we identified evaluation questions, and we identified assumptions. So first the assumptions, and then the evaluation questions around it for each causal claim, for the impact claim, and for the 3 contribution claims. So you see on top also, I specified a little bit like the links. We focused on links, not on outcome areas. We didn't measure indicators. We didn't measure outcomes. We measured links, causal links. And we identified methods specifically to inquire these causal links. So you see on the top the kind of symbols. It symbols the type of links for which we identified different types of methods. So there also the other, this is at the lowest level of the theory of change, where the program mechanisms influence the intermediate changes and then lead to the ultimate impacts on the right side. So again, these are, you see here, the mechanisms, M's. This is a mechanism that we needed to focus on, the farmer field fora, the micro-enterprise fund, the good practice centers, and then here, the district stakeholder fora, which were kind of market convening forums. And these are the causal links that we needed to inquire. So we identified evaluation questions and assumptions for each of these contribution claims, impact claim, and the causal links in it. Here you see the different types of methods that we used for inquiring these different types of links at a different level levels of change and influence in the theory of change. So there you have, at the highest impact level, impact claim, a household survey, standard, classic for statistical analysis, combined overlapping with a generic change analysis, which used PRA-based methods and also causal flow mapping. Then livelihoods analysis at an intermediate change level. We used the livelihood change analysis, which also used causal flow mapping, overlapping with the generic change analysis, and including also a pilot of SenseMaker, some of the sense-making methods that was mentioned by Elizabeth. And then at the lowest level, at the level of the direct effects of program mechanisms on these intermediate changes in livelihoods, we piloted constituent voice, which is actually more a kind of a monitoring tool, a feedback tool that is used in ongoing monitoring. But we use it also here to collect from different key stakeholders their feedback and their perceptions about the use and the effects and the outcomes of the program mechanisms on their production, on their processing, on their ability to link to other key actors in the value chains and the market. And then combined with some key informant interviews. Sampling, I'm not going to go into much detail, but the sampling obviously is also very, very important. So the key unit of analysis here was not the household, but it was the system, the local supply chain system, linking up to bigger markets of commodity chains, of root and tuber commodity chains. So we randomly sampled, 30 supply chains defined by its supply chain leaders or good practice centers or industries or even just local markets. And then within these systems, we also sampled households and then smallholders to participate in the participatory methods. Okay, so I need to run. Assessing causality. Assessing causality, another big important part of it is the participatory sense-making at local and aggregated level before turning to the final analysis. So the idea is to engage stakeholders in validating the emerging evidence and the theory of change by reconstructing, again, the theory of change, but with the evidence that is emerging, to obtain an extra layer of explanations, to create debate about contributions and responsibilities, individual and collective responsibilities. We had bankers in the room. We had processors, farmers, illiterate farmers. We had policymakers. We had IFAD in the room. We had the government, obviously. And 30% of the participants were farmers and processors, so the smallholders that the program was actually targeting. So it's very important to have the right methods and tools to make sure that you do enable voice, that it's not just token participation, but real participation and real debate, solid debate. So in Ghana, we had 23 local workshops with 640 participants and one national one with 110 participants. This is the contribution scoring matrix that we used. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I can explain you. Is the basis for the configurational analysis. A much bigger Excel file is behind it that has also the detailed explanations for each contribution claim. These are the contribution claims, yeah? And then the impact claim, where we score the causal links and the strength of evidence. And we also have we also scored like binary scoring for the presence of the mechanisms. And then the configuration analysis basically looks at the patterns across the sample of the supply chains, the 30 supply chains, configurations of different scores, comparing and analyzing different patterns in each causal claim and then zipping up the evidence along the theory of change to reach conclusions. For more information, you can contact me, or you can contact the client, IFAT in Edward Heinemann. More resources, everything you can find on the IFAT website. And just to tell you that PIALA is not a methodology, but it's an approach that that can embed any kind of method so long it's consistent with the principles of thinking systemically and enabling voice. Thank you.
Okay, I like to move around a little bit more, so I'm going to stand away from the podium. Okay. I'm Adrienne Gifford. I'm with the Initiative for Global Development, and I'm going to talk to you just for a brief couple of minutes. I'm going to try to keep it pretty short. I think we need to make up a little bit of time here so you guys have plenty of time for Q&A. But talk about an impact assessment that I conducted, that my team conducted in the Niger Delta. So first, just to kind of reference back to the plenary session this morning, one thing that I think makes this assessment a little bit different is that the donor was actually a private sector actor. So in this case, in 2010, Chevron invested $50 million in the Niger Delta. And what they did was they established two sister foundations. The first one is NDPI, the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, which is based in Washington, D.C. And the other is the Partnership Initiative for the Niger Delta, which is actually the implementing agent based in the Niger Delta. And actually one of the Shola is right here. Can you raise your hand a little bit? Yeah, so if you have any questions about the assessment, you can also refer to Shola, who is the M&E expert on the ground. How it works is that Chevron basically allocates its money in 5-year tranches. They allocate that money to NDPI, who really works with the international donor community, really creating awareness for what NDPI and PIND are doing in the Niger Delta, and really fashioning a lot of partnerships and a lot of alliances, so they are not the only implementing partner on the ground. And PIND is the implementing partner based in Nigeria. They have a headquarters based in Abuja. And then they also have 2 economic development centers that they have stood up. One is in Warri, and the other is located in Port Harcourt. They are taking a market systems approach. This is a map sort of where all of their interventions are. And as I mentioned, this is a partnership-based model. So you also have DFID, as well as USAID, as well as more than 400 other implementing partners. Many of them are local. About 80% of them are local NGOs and CSOs that they are working with in partnership to implement all of these interventions. So as you can imagine, it was quite a large assessment. They're primarily working in 3 value chains: aquaculture, palm oil, and cassava. And then they're also working to address WASH-related challenges, and also working in interventions to enhance the enabling environment to enable those 3 value chains. This is a little bit about the assessment scope. Again, I work for the Initiative for Global Development. We are a Washington-based nonprofit. We are a membership-based organization that really focuses on the voice of the private sector across Africa. So we bring our private sector companies, and a lot of them are multinationals such as Chevron, but a lot of them are also African born and bred businesses, and really working at the intersection of the private sector and development. So how can we create more inclusive business models? So we've developed sort of a I wouldn't call it a standardized approach to impact assessment, but it's a business-oriented approach to impact assessment, and I think that's one of the things that we were able to leverage in this assessment. In terms of what we were really attempting to answer, there was a lot of questions about systemic change. How many of you in the room have children? Can you raise your hands? And have any of you taken them on a long road trip? And what is the common question that the kids always ask when they're sitting in the back of the seat? When are we going to get there? So I feel like this was kind of the question that Chevron and NDPI and PIND were asking us is, we've invested $50 million. When are we going to get there? When are we going to reach systemic change? When can we stop having to invest all this money? Because $50 million is a lot of money, even for a large multinational such as Chevron. So they really wanted to know, when will systemic change be achieved? And how much impact have you really had to date? And then, of course, there was also all of these other great things about sharing information, such as with PIN, or here at the Beam Exchange, and on other platforms. And also a lot of questions about how we quantify the multiplier effect. So I'm going to talk about the assessment, 3 large areas which we address. So the navigating complexity, the thinking systemically, and then evaluating systemic change. And I think you're going to see a lot of overlap between what Dinda has talked about and what Finn and Elizabeth have also alluded to in the theory. So hopefully you'll see a lot of correlation. Let's see. Okay. So in terms of understanding the theory of change and the operating model, because we were in, one other thing I would point out is that this was really a rapid assessment. It was 6 months. There were 2 field trips made. We did meet with, it was a very participatory approach. We met with more than 300 different stakeholders through 75 or 80 different interviews. And then, of course, Shola and her team have done a really outstanding job of doing a lot of the M&E up front. So there was a lot of data that we were able to use in terms of secondary data that was brought into the report. I think we reviewed more than 600 different documents, and we had a tool that we used to sort of gather all of this information and go through it in kind of quick fashion. But really, their theory of change is that economic development in an area such as the Niger Delta is very, very conflict-oriented. And so economic development is really contributes to and is both dependent on peace building. So a lot of the initiatives that they are also working on are peace-related initiatives. And then the third area where they're really, their interventions are focused, as I mentioned, is on the ecosystem and the enabling environment. They've developed media and platforms for sharing information across all of the implementing partners and with the beneficiaries. They have developed what they call the appropriate technologies for economic development, where they actually develop appropriate technologies for smallholder farmers and for other SMEs. And they introduce them and they test them and they adapt them and they do all of this piloting. So there's a lot of showcase and demonstration effect. They've established physical presences. As I mentioned, they have both an economic development center based in Port Harcourt as well as in Warri. And they've done all of the upfront research and analysis, feasibility studies, so on and so forth, that also allow the other implementing partners to really design successful interventions. And they've also, of course, one thing that can't be left out in the Niger Delta is having an efficient security network so that all of the people that are working there are safe. So how they actually, how we described what they are doing is that they are empowering existing actors, so existing value chain actors, smallholder farmers, input providers, processors, small-scale processors, large off-takers, and they're also catalyzing new entrants in, both in terms of other implementing partners. When we talked with DFID, when we talked with USAID, there was a lot of skepticism about working in the Niger Delta. I mean, there were even interventions going on up in the north, in Boko Haram region, but not so much. There was not as much intervention going on in the Niger Delta. So because they were able to establish that presence, they were actually able to catalyze in new investment. They're able to catalyze in new interventions, and they're able to catalyze in new NGOs into the space, so on and so forth. They work in terms of capacity building through building partnerships and networks, and the networks is a key piece that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And then the proving models work, and this is something that we saw consistently, is that in order for smallholder farmers or any market actor to actually adopt an intervention, they have to kind of see it to believe it and prove that it actually works. So this is how we described their operating model, and how we described their theory of change is a little bit different than how they had described it to us. And then what we did was we needed to simplify it down in order to be able to actually do some measurement. And so this is sort of our depiction of economic development really being at the core, supported by the peace-building interventions, and then around that, the infrastructure, or the enabling environment, which we broke out into infrastructure, which is the wash, the power, the access to power, and the access to effective transportation systems. Work with policies and institutions, because they also do capacity building with local government as well as national government, and really focusing on what policies and regulations really need to change in order to affect and enable market systems. And then the work that they do to create a healthy civil society. So there's a lot of capacity building that they do with the local NGOs and local CSOs that also contribute to helping establish these value chains, and also work with local SMEs. Okay, so in terms of thinking systemically, a lot of what we needed to do was really clarify what is the systemic change that you're looking to have with each one of these different actors. This is a really broad set of people that you're working with. The value chains are obviously very complex in and of themselves, and really working with them, we spent a lot of time talking about defining and refining what does systemic change mean to you? What is it that you're looking to do? When NDPI and PIND are no longer working in the Niger Delta, what is it that you want to leave behind? What's the legacy? How will it work? So what we did was we established a framework whereby we, and again, this is a bit high level. I think you could probably do a 6-month, a year-long, a 5-year-long assessment on any single one of these value chains. So this is not the end-all be-all, and we have made recommendations for additional studies that could take place afterwards. But to really give a sense of what has the impact been, this is sort of a sample from our framework. So we stayed consistent with the model. So here's how they're empowering existing farmers, and we grouped everyone else together in terms of value chain actors. So that's your input processors, or your input providers, your processors, your warehousing, and your larger off-takers. And how are you catalyzing new farmers into the market system as well as new value chain actors? And what we did was we developed what we call impact statements. So these are the things that we want to see happen, and we want to see them happen systemically. We want to see them happen sustainably again and again. We developed this for pretty much every area of all of the intervention areas. And actually, I'll just kind of go back. What we term these things as areas of innovation, okay? And innovation is a term broadly used. Gonna kind of speed it up a little bit. It's easy to go for 15 minutes very quickly. Okay, so in terms of how we evaluated systemic change, there's 3 methodologies that we applied that I want to talk through really briefly. The first one is the qualitative behavior, the qualitative outcomes. Through this framework, we had the standard metrics and indicators that are quantitative, but one of the things that we were really seeing is how do we really tell the story about what's happening with each of the actors that we're trying to evaluate. And we identified that knowledge, attitude, capacity, discourse, action, and social norms, this is really a process that occurs, and you're going to see it a little bit later on. And we had really some more detailed level indicators, which we defined very clearly. And we saw this happening again and again, that in order to adopt an innovation, this is a process that people go through in order to adopt an innovation and to really, before systemic change can occur. The second methodology that I would talk about is rate of adoption. So this was our way of answering the multiplier effect question. I don't know if any of you have heard of the theory of diffusion of innovation, but this is what we were seeing on the ground through our observations. And the way that we actually were able to measure it is that we looked at specific innovations within those areas of innovation. So for example, one of the things that they introduced was a mechanical adjustable harvester for palm oil farmers. Rather than having to climb 40 feet up a tree, this actually harvests the palm seeds very quickly. And so how quickly and how long is it going to take before this innovation is as big as the Samsung phone or the Apple iPhone? How long will it take for all of the actors to adopt it? So there is a diffusion equation, and there are 2 coefficients that really drive this. And I think you all agree that innovation spreads by word of mouth, and it spreads through an advertising effect. And so we use a commercial off-the-shelf software that actually uses, you can input past data. So we gathered past data from these various interventions. And some of them, there was sufficient to do regression analysis, and some there was not. This is quite a lot of these are new interventions. But it also provides analogous systems. So looking at how long did it take for hybrid corn seed to spread through a population? How long did it take for baling hay to spread? So on and so forth. So we selected a number of analogous systems, and we plotted the past data, and it really sort of gave a little bit of an idea of how long is it going to take to reach a certain population. And what we did was then apply the tipping point theory. The tipping point theory looks at a population of people, okay? So the people that are the most, your innovators, your entrepreneurs, if you will, are the first 2.5%. And then you have the early adopters, 13.5%. Then you have people like me who are a laggard, and I never wanted to buy a smartphone, and it took somebody like going to the store and buying it for me before I actually started to use it. So the tipping point theory basically says that once you've reached that first 16% of a population, that the innovation will become self-sustaining. So that's kind of giving the answer in a way, albeit there are a lot of assumptions made, and we can talk about that during Q&A if you want, in terms of when are we going to reach a level of systemic change. When you've reached 16% of the population, then you can probably begin to withdraw, and the innovation will become self-sustaining. So we measured that. And then this last methodology that I want to talk about is just painting the picture in terms of we measured all of these different innovations. We were able to provide quantitative and qualitative outcomes and impact measurements. But where does this kind of all fit in the big picture? You know, Chevron and NDPI and PIND wanted to know. And so what we did was we developed a maturity model. And we, at the top, it should actually say, so this is ad hoc, pilot stage, a level of stickiness. So this is the point in where the curve, where things really start to take off. Is the story being retold? Are change agents taking the best practices that you gave to them in the intervention, and are they retelling it? Are they telling others? To the point that it reaches a level of scale and then eventually systemic change. And the criteria along which we evaluated each one of the 50 impact statements that we identified that then rolls up to the innovations, that then rolls up to the areas of innovation, are along, has there been a coordinated strategy and implementation plan? Has there been a really solid network of relationships developed amongst all of the actors? How well is the human capital aligned? How well are the resources amongst all the implementing partners really focused on the same things, and how well are they evaluating, monitoring, and how well are they monitoring and evaluating things, which in this assessment was thrown out because it's the point of the thing. So we basically scored all of the impact statements, averaged them by up to the innovations, and it painted us a picture of where all of their innovations stood in terms of maturity, from the least mature to the most mature, and also gives a sense of how interrelated they are. So in terms of, like, for example, aquaculture, in terms of the value chain development, they're doing a really great job, and not to say that they're not doing a good job. A lot of it's about just maturity and runtime. But in terms of creating access to finance throughout that value chain, it's an area that needs a little bit more work. And that's basically all I have to say. So I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions. I went over that pretty quickly, but thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn it over to Marcus.
I wanted to find out from these projects what has been their experience in terms of engaging these partners to collect relevant data. What sort of incentives have they used to ensure that these partners collect relevant data?
Is there any of the particular examples you wanted to ask Adinda or Adrienne or Adinda?
So we really try to convince our sponsors to pick out programs more midterm, so to exactly to address that thing. But obviously, Piala is designed with the idea that it's most cost-effective and most useful when you start to use it and build it into impact M&E from the very beginning of the program. And that would imply that some of the methods that are inquiring some of the causal links in the theory of change would be, the data would be collected by the partners. Yeah, and even could be self-collected by people. Yeah, constituent feedback is a methodology that can, constituent voice is a methodology that can be used for that. SenseMaker is a methodology, but also many of the PRA-based methods that we used. So can be used by the partners, and you identify actually the methods that can be used for ongoing impact monitoring. On the other hand, there are moments that you need an independent team coming in and collecting additional independent data to cross-check the data. So the cross-checking is very important. I think that, is this a...
I think one aspect was the incentives. So if you have self-collection, what kind of incentive can you use for the people to actually contribute their data, not just say, why should I contribute?
We saw a high level of energy among people participating in the design workshop as well as in the sense-making workshops when they actually started to really see the evidence adding up and connecting to each other, and getting an understanding of how systemic change did happen or did not happen and why. And so I think that's the biggest incentive that you can create, is involving key stakeholders at the right moments, in the right places, in the design and the sense-making of the data, because that's where the energy starts. I think that's the biggest incentive.
A question from me to you, Marcus, probably, is that, I mean, the presentations were much more related to internal evaluations funded by the projects, as far as I've gathered. But the donors themselves, I mean, midterm evaluation and final evaluation, they have huge influence on the course of the project. And I didn't really see that implication here. So how do you relate to that? And
I'm not sure if I would share this assessment. I think this there was a big focus on external evaluation, maybe funded through the organizations themselves. But for example, as far as I understand, the NDPI PIN evaluation was funded by the organization, but it was an external, like IGD being an external agent coming in to do some sort of an external evaluation. The same with PIALA, which was, as I understand, an evaluation that was coming from the outside. So it's not the project people themselves doing the evaluation. Going back to the theory parts, the evaluation guide that Finn introduced, which was developed by the Beam Exchange, does have a focus on external evaluations, on impact assessments, or whether it's external or not. I mean, this is another sort of modality that needs to be discussed, but it does have a focus on impact assessments, not on continuous monitoring. Now, obviously, the principle that Elizabeth introduced, they cover multiple areas. They can cover both project monitoring, monitoring for adaptive management, but also external evaluation. So I think we kind of cover the whole spectrum a little bit. Other questions? There's one all the way in the back.
Thanks. Sorry, I can't hop down there. Jim Woodhill, providing support for the Global Donor Platform at the moment. I found a very fascinating set of discussions around the methodology for trying to get this right. I guess my question to all of you would be, what's your experience of some of the, I guess, the political economics of doing monitoring and evaluation work? Because it seems to me that we've got some major incentive challenges, but also I suspect the amount that actually gets spent on doing M&E is a fraction of what we're spending. I think we heard Difford this morning saying they're spending nearly $1 billion. So I mean, do we just have a massive gap between the incentive structures and the investment in M&E to actually get the expectations we have here? And how, have you seen in your work any ways of trying to overcome that gap?
Any of you want to have a quick go at that?
I'm going to kind of reference Shola again, because I think one of the things with our impact assessment is that it may have, and my hope is that it actually helped to reduce the burden in some ways. I think we introduced some new things that need to be measured, but we were looking at all of the quarterly reports that had been put out previously. There were a lot of metrics and indicators, maybe close to 600. And so, and obviously they have a really broad range of programs as well, but I think one of the things that this assessment helped to do was to really key in on what are the couple of key things that you really need to measure to qualify this impact, and then to be able to coordinate that with your partners, if you will. I don't think that NDPI and PIN could probably ever plan to coordinate the same measurement approach and methods across 500 different partners, but I think that they can share the approach, and I think that that's something that they've been working on doing. And I think by telling this story consistently, so if you're measuring one thing in one quarter and another 2 quarters later, it doesn't really tell the consistent story. So I think it really helped them focus on what were the key things, so as to not become so burdensome and not spend the majority of the time on M&E, but really focus on the implementation.
Do you? No. So in PIALA, obviously, first of all, correction, the pilot in Ghana was on demand of the Ghanaian government and was also co-funded by the Ghanaian government. But we insisted on keeping our independence. Independence in mobilizing, in sampling, in selection, and then engaging the right stakeholders in the right spaces. So that was our purpose. In terms of dealing with the politics of evidence, what we did was engaging all these key stakeholders in framing the evaluation and deciding on how we would rate contribution. Yeah, and how we would measure it and what would be the focus. And we didn't use indicators on purpose, but formulated questions and let them formulate the questions. So that's one thing. Nonetheless, in the sense-making workshop, it was very interesting when we did an exercise first in small groups and then in plenary, engaging all the key stakeholders in contribution rating. And like, it's not definite, but it was like to create debate around it. we saw that all the government people, all the people who were responsible for implementing and managing the program were rating their the contributions in all the areas, intervention areas of the program, maximum positive in all areas. And so we let them rate from maximum contribution influence of the program to overrun by other influences. And they all put it on maximum impact, positive impact, while the farmers and processors rated very meticulous. And for different areas, for the northern, middle belt, southern part of Ghana, they had different scores. So there was a moment of silence because the farmers and the processors were always had the first word, and so they presented their results, and then came the government people came and they presented their results, and there was a moment of silence, and people were starting to laugh because it showed like a lack of learning, a lack of critical reflection, while they actually agreed up front with the questions and the rating system and so on. So you see still going on like this defense mechanism. But anyway, so.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time has run out. I don't want you to come to lunch too late, so the buffet is hopefully not empty. But the good news is most of our speakers will be here again in this room at 3:30. And we'll have a poster session. So there will be different posters, well, about 9 different posters talking about different topics around innovation, on monitoring innovations in evaluation.